It's time for another edition of Lewis at Large, 60 minutes of smart talk radio featuring guests from all walks of life in conversation with your host, Warner Lewis. So sit back and lend us your ears for the next hour. Now here with today's first guest is the host of Lewis at Large, Warner Lewis.
Well, welcome everybody to another edition of Lewis at Large. Here's truly Warner Lewis from the flight deck. And as always, that means some smart talk radios in your future, and we're very excited this segment to have with us Colleen Rowley. Who is Colleen Rowley? She is a former special agent for the FBI. We're going to be talking security, your security, some national security, and what all the factors are and how life today in the world of trying to keep things secure and safe is much different than it was many, many years ago. Very pleased again to have her. Colleen, how are you, my friend?
Fine. We have, I think, 60-some degrees up here in Minnesota today.
So you're kind of getting some nice weather. That's good for you. Well, listen, let's dive right into this. Share, if you would, Colleen, a little bit. You're a former FBI special agent. Tell us a little bit about what path led you to the FBI, and then bring us up to the time that you were no longer there.
Well, I think many people develop career aspirations due to television and fiction. At least that certainly is the case in the FBI. So when I was a little, 11, 12-year-old, I was watching Man from U.N.C.L.E. and wrote to the FBI, I want to join, et cetera, et cetera. Long story. But it's ultimately the FBI is a good career if you care about justice. Solving crimes, even defeating organized crime. I worked on Italian LCN, organized crime in New York for a period of time, which was very rewarding because it was the time when they took down the top mafia family hierarchy. And I just had a varied career until I was transferred to Minnesota, and I became the legal counsel in the office for about 13 years, and also taught constitutional law and ethics. And so when 9/11 happens, which was just actually a couple of years before I was eligible to retire, and there was afterwards 9/11, there was really a cover-up. No one wanted to tell the truth. The agency heads did not want to come clean, and even to this day, some of the things are still missing. The CIA has never divulged why it did not share information with the FBI that two of the terrorist suspects that they had been tracking for a couple of years had come into California. And so, that's one very big piece. Why wouldn't you tell another agency when two terrorist suspects have come into California? And these turned out to be the pilots of the planes. And the CIA had known this for 2 years. And to this day, after all this time, they still haven't told the truth about it. And the other thing that still is out there is the 28 pages, which did apparently, the investigators did find linkages of funding by Saudi Arabia of not just maybe these specific hijackers, and maybe even some of the specific hijackers, but also Al-Qaeda in general. And so that's still been blacked out all these years. So what my role was in May of 2002, I was testifying to the Joint Intelligence Committee 8.5 months after 9/11, after Dick Cheney had been unsuccessful in keeping any accountability. This had finally started. I wrote a memo to make sure that I wouldn't forget anything, and this memo got leaked to the public. It led to a 2-year-long Inspector General investigation of the FBI's pre-9/11 failures. So, and then I ended up testifying to the Senate Judiciary Committee about it as well. So, I had this role where I was not the only one. Many people knew about this, but I just had a chance to get some bit of truth out. And, some truth eventually, after 3 years or so, did come out about 9/11. Not everything, as I just said.
I have a question for you. That year, by the way, as well, you were also named one of Time Magazine's Persons of the Year. Was it your contention, and I don't want to dwell too long on this, but it is a fascinating story, in your memo to the FBI talking about some of the FBI's failures, were the failures in nature their lack of ability to recognize the threat, the recognizing of the threat but not sharing information and acting on it, what was the essence? And to add to that, was it just the FBI? Were there other members, as far as you know, in your limited knowledge of what they were doing, of the American intelligence community, where also there were breakdowns?
Yes, it was pretty extensive. And so you can't really simplify this and generalize to say it was this or that, because the high-level people like Condi Rice, like Ashcroft, like George Bush, I would say, by and large, just had different agendas. For instance, John Ashcroft, the Attorney General, ranked terrorism as his lowest priority in August of 2001. He ranked violent crime as his highest priority. And so when you do that, when the whole Department of Justice says violent crime is the top priority, terrorism is the lowest priority, you can just imagine the signals that are sent throughout the agency. Well, if somebody calls up about terrorism, well, that's not even a priority. So, but why did he do that? Did he do it for some nefarious reason? No. His agenda was to reinitiate the death penalty in the United States. He wanted to have a lot more death penalty cases. And he thought violent crime was the vehicle to get larger numbers of death penalty cases. Now, Condi Rice, we could talk about this all day, but Condi Rice, for instance, her agenda was that she wanted to restart the Cold War by getting the United States to withdraw from the anti-ballistic missile treaty. And that was done immediately after 9/11. They wrote a memo and the United States withdrew from this. But you can see that these various steps now it took a few years, but they finally have led to getting back to that era where we had, a main enemy in the Cold War, and all of the money can be pumped into nuclear weapons and F-15s, etc. She was a Russian expert, and so that was her big goal. And so in July of 2001, 2 months before 9/11, Richard Clarke, they said that their hair was on fire. Both Richard Clarke and George Tenet, they were getting flooded with so much information about 9/11, and Richard Clarke went into her office and said, we've got to do something. Bin Laden is determined to attack, etc. And she basically dismissed him. And, again, I don't think it was some kind of nefarious plot. I think it was simply that she had a completely different goal than anything dealing with terrorism. And, of course, afterwards, then she, gives this line about no one would have ever known a plane would fly into a building, even though she had been part of a planning emergency plan for one of their meetings that anticipated a plane would fly into a building, and there had been at least 3 or 4 prior plots to fly planes into the Eiffel Tower, into the CIA, etc. So, basically officials don't want to tell the truth about whenever and it's not just, again, oftentimes people think, this had to be deliberate, but even negligence, even when they're negligent, and as far as I know, most of the negligence involved officials not reading their memos, important memos that would come to them. Again, we're not talking about low level, we're talking about the high level. Even memos that said Bin Laden was entwined with the Chechen leader in April of 2001 at the highest levels of the FBI. The officials afterwards claimed they hadn't read it. So that was one part. Then there's this other part where the agencies did not share information with each other, which is the story of the CIA not telling the FBI about the 2 terrorist suspects, or even about the meeting itself in Kuala Lumpur 2 years before. And then the last one was the failure to act. And so you actually, get George Bush after he's been briefed in August saying, well, fine, you've briefed me, but he doesn't do anything with it. And George Tenet did not act on the information he was briefed on in August about the Moussaoui case. Afterwards, when 9/11 actually occurs, he's eating breakfast and somebody runs in and says a plane has flown into the World Trade Center, and George Tenet says, I wonder if it's the guy in Minnesota. So the reason he knew that was because he had been briefed about 3 weeks before. And so, but then he didn't do anything, and he just shrugs afterwards and says, it's not my job. So I think it's a myriad of a mixture of those reasons, and by and large, what they have done after 9/11 has exacerbated it and made it far, far worse. One of the things that we're dealing with now in the as you see in the news, with the FBI fighting Apple to try to get their iPhone, they say it's one iPhone, but it's not. It's simply all the iPhones out there that are encrypted and have passwords. The FBI wants an easy way to get into all of these secure communications. So they use that one iPhone of one of the San Bernardino shooters in order to, as an example that they thought would compel then the judge and even Congress then to open the door to this. But that has been the essence after 9/11, which was turning on the floodgates of collecting all of these myriad, actually it's trillions of pieces of non-relevant data, which is all what they call metadata. All of our calls, all of our emails, all have been vacuumed up and put into this giant NSA computer at Scottsbluff. All of the agencies have been engaged in their own different programs, even including informants. And the FBI now is trying to get teachers and students to call them up about every other student they see as suspicious. You can just imagine the databases. I mean, they are trillions of pieces of non-relevant info. So that's actually hurt the effort then to actually find a needle in the haystack, is they've added all this hay onto the haystack. And so I think if people understand what happens is people think, oh, if you can prevent terrorism and you can keep me safe, sure, I'll give up my privacy, my First Amendment, my Fourth Amendment, my Fifth Amendment rights. You know, people are prepared to give up all of their constitutional rights if they're told that these things are making them safer. But the truth is all of these things that they've done after 9/11, including starting the wars, have increased the level of worldwide terrorism. About 6,000% at this point. Since 9/11, terrorism has gone up 6,000%. And there's a lot of other disastrous consequences from these actions that they told us they were making us safer. They told us this was good. And in fact, these things have all hurt the effort terribly. And if people knew, we wouldn't have done that. First of all, we wouldn't have done them in the first place, and certainly now we would be pulling out of doing these things. And in the Apple case, maybe we've turned a corner because it looks like one judge in a similar case said no. He said, no, we're not going to have an extraordinary order that allows the FBI then to unlock all secure communications because it's going to hurt the security, people's financial information, health information. It's going to hurt security everywhere if we let the FBI get these kinds of backdoors. So one judge already ruled that way, and they're waiting for the judge in the San Bernardino case. And then in Congress earlier this week, the heads of the intelligence agencies grilled the FBI director, Comey, and basically all hard questions about why can't you do this in different ways. He really had no good answers. And they all, of course, made the point that by defeating the company's security, you're going to be actually making all of us more vulnerable to things like identity theft, to hackers, etc.
Right.
So
if you just joined...
It's looking like maybe we've turned a corner and finally people are kind of waking up about this.
If you just joined us, yours truly, Warner Lewis from the flight deck of Lewis at Large Radio. Our special guest this segment, and got a good one going here, talking to former FBI Special Agent Colleen Rowley, who sent a memo, as she discussed earlier, to then FBI Director Robert Mueller, talking about some of the FBI's pre-9/11 failures. She was also named that same year one of Time's Persons of the Year. I don't want to we could talk about 9/11 forever, but unfortunately we're limited here with time. I do want to ask you a question. Based on what you know and your work with the FBI at the time, did the FBI, just singularly the FBI, have enough information, in your opinion, about what could happen on 9/11, whether it was that day specifically, but about those who carried out this operation, that something could have been done based on what they knew and the information available to them?
Yes. And the FBI is not the only agency that could have done a lot more.
I wanted to ask you that.
And very likely could have at least reduced 9/11, if not prevented it. This isn't even me saying this. This is the 9/11 Commission that found this.
What about separately? and again, I understand you're with the FBI, but based on what you know, what about the Central Intelligence Agency?
The Central Intelligence Agency and the NSA were not exposed very well by the 9/11 Commission or the Joint Intelligence Committee. And that's because there were no whistleblowers in those agencies, I think is part of the problem. And they all kind of said, this is our story. And they, of course, threw up right away, national security, we can't talk about it. Their directors kind of almost chuckled at the fact that the FBI was actually came under the hammer quite a bit more than they did. So we still to this day, like I said, there's some very key things that no one knows about how much the NSA knew, how much the CIA knew. We have some, I'm going to recommend something. There's a New Yorker TV. It's called New Yorker TV, and I think it's called The Agent, done by Lawrence Wright, who's a real expert on 9/11. It features two FBI agents, Ali Soufan, who was actually the FBI's top Arabic-speaking agent who investigated the Cole bombing before 9/11, and Mark Rossini, who was detailed to the CIA's Counterterrorism Center. And they are talking on this very same topic. Why did the CIA not tell the FBI when they knew two of the terrorist suspects were coming into the United States? And it just came out about 2 weeks ago, and it's called New Yorker TV, The Agent. It's very short. It's only like 15 minutes long. Yeah. It's like a documentary, very worth watching.
All right, I have another question for you, and that is this. In your role, why were you uniquely qualified? Why was Colleen Rowley? Why would you necessarily have been the one to send a memo to Robert Mueller? What was your role with the FBI, and what kind of work were you doing at the time?
Well, I was, like I said, the legal counsel, taught constitutional law. I had a very peripheral, small role in this Moussaoui investigation that just happened to take place in Minnesota. You know, that was a complete, fluke that one of the terrorist suspects came here and tried to take flight lessons. His flight school instructors were whistleblowers themselves and called the FBI. And then we had a very astute agent who only had a couple of years in, but he ran out there right away. He himself had been a pilot, and he was in Navy intelligence. And when they told him this was the most suspicious flight student they'd ever had, it immediately, it all, fell into place. He sent leads to France. France sent back right away that they found that he had been working for the Chechen terrorist leader Ibn Khattab. There's parts of this then that it's a long story, a real long story, but this case has a lot of screw-ups and flaws in it, and one of which is that these officials claim they never read that memo in April that Ibn Khattab was working with bin Laden. So it got thwarted, that case did, and then afterwards there was a cover-up. And because I knew about it and I was asked to testify to the Joint Intelligence Committee in Congress, and that's also a very long story, I decided just that someone had to tell the full truth. The agents also, especially this agent with 3 years in, Harry Sammet, his name is known because he ended up being the main witness in the Moussaoui trial. So if you Google him, even on Wikipedia, you can Google Harry Sammet and read the whole long story. But Sammet ended up testifying in that case that it was criminal negligence on the part of FBI headquarters, that they did not act on this information that he immediately sent in to them. And he was not the only one. A Phoenix agent was sending in his findings that terrorists were training in flight schools. There was just a whole, like I said, the 9/11 Commission called it, the system was blinking red. And so after 9/11, when they said, no one would have known that any of this would happen, and by the way, let's attack Iraq. And people saying, what? And Richard Clark was saying, what? Iraq has nothing to do with Al-Qaeda. In fact, they're the enemy of Al-Qaeda. But the whole country was in the dark for 2 or 3 years about this, and this is, it's the saddest thing in the world to see such rampant ignorance then lead to worse, and like I said, increasing terrorism of what has gone on since that time. Not only 9/11 itself is terrible, that people didn't act at the time, they didn't connect the dots, that's the term, but then you have this problem afterwards where they go in the wrong direction and actually increase terrorism. And now it's really, really hard to pull out of this because there's the hatred and the sectarian conflicts in the Mideast have just been made thousands of times worse. And now people are saying, well, you have to look in the United States to see if somebody could be inspired by ISIS and whatever. Well, I mean, why did we get to here? Why did we get to this position? This is incredibly, and again, partly because the public didn't know. I think that's the main reason. Yeah. The public has just been in the dark.
Well, tell us about the circumstances and how you left the FBI.
Well, I had to step down from my legal counsel when they did attack Iraq. I became too outspoken. I knew that the FBI actually had proof that Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11. Dick Cheney would go around saying that Mohammed Atta, one of the hijackers, had met in Prague with Iraqi intelligence, and that was one of the many lies that they used to say that Saddam was behind 9/11. They got 70% of the country to believe that Iraq was behind 9/11. I still see op-eds written by people saying, that they think Iraq had something to do with 9/11. So I knew that was not true, and I wrote a memo. It went into a newspaper because there was only about a week before the attack. And then, of course, because the war fever was so high at that time, people in my office said we can't trust Colleen Rowley. She's too outspoken. So I stepped down from my legal role already, and I only had about a little over a year before I was eligible to retire. So as soon as I was eligible to retire, I decided to leave, and
right.
Actually, I was able to speak out. I do write op-eds. I've been published in the New York Times and Los Angeles Times, and when I just said Los Angeles Times, I'm going to recommend another op-ed that I wrote that explains some of this. It's called WikiLeaks and 9/11: What If? And it's about the fact that if there had been more information, which is possible through a WikiLeaks, when people, in government know really fraud, waste, abuse, illegal acts, they have a vehicle like WikiLeaks, and even the Moussaoui arrest itself. If that had been known, that might have been able to prevent 9/11, that alone itself. So it's very counterintuitive that more information in the public is going to make us safer. The government tells us that more secrecy keeps us safe, and it's just exactly the opposite.
I have a question for you. At some point in your lifetime and in mine, do you believe that, and I know you have tried and so have others, and you're not on a witch hunt, but you're trying to get the truth out, and you were there. Do you believe that somehow, some way, the definitive story of not only all of these breakdowns at all of these agencies, as you claim, and the various lacks of communications and responses, will that story, do you believe, ever be told, and therefore believe it, and therefore will we learn from it? And have we learned as of 2016?
They always say history is always being written, so you have these first books and articles, etc. And I mentioned Lawrence Wright because he wrote a book 4 or 5 years after 9/11. I haven't read it all, but I think it's pretty good. It's pretty accurate. It still doesn't contain everything, of course, because you'd have to have an encyclopedia to really run down all of this. And like I said, to this day, the truth is not known about some very key things. So I think eventually a lot of truth will come out. There's also another famous saying that I think Gandhi said this, that truth is the highest God. And so it means that it's kind of like an ultimate God or perfection that you can never actually attain. You can get closer to it. And sometimes history, though, gets rewritten over time because of political agendas and things. Look at this Armenian genocide hundreds of years later. People don't want the truth to come out, so there's a lot of push. The Lusitania is still apparently classified. It's like 100 years ago that this Lusitania sank, and some of the information about that is still, to this day, covered up. Because why would that be? Why would people care if something that happened 100 years ago? Because history is important. It's important to know if government leaders don't tell the truth. Maybe they think, it would decrease the trust in governments if we know the truth, some of the truth about these things. But it's something to aim for, and in most cases, over time, historians do a pretty good job. But the only thing is you have to read a lot. You can't just read one book. You have to, if you're really interested in a topic, you have to do what a historian does, which is read everything on that topic.
Well, you know a lot about this subject. You lived it for a long time. I'm just curious as we kind of wind down here. Based on what you know, based on what you see, overall, are Americans, at least residing in the homeland, are they more or less safe from the act of a terrorist or a terrorist group? And I know that's a big, gigantic question, but just in general, give us your observations.
No, I don't think we are safer. I think that the level of terrorism is very important. And this is worldwide terrorism. These are incidents all over the world. But I think that's very important because it bodes that it's easy. The San Bernardino couple wasn't a part of a group. They weren't part of an organized group. But they just take their inspiration from seeing that this fight and this, again, when you see other countries in the world being bombed, etc., some people are going to get angry about that. The other big threat that we have that actually is domestic terrorism is something the FBI calls active shooters. And these are all the shootings. The motivations are very vague. In many cases, it's a mentally ill person that just gets a lot of guns and ammunition and goes to a mall, to a church, to a theater, to a parking lot. These are happening now almost every other day. Already a year ago, the FBI had documented that they had tripled active shooters. Their definition, by the way, is killing 4 or more people. So if you go to a parking lot and you only shoot 2, it's not even going to count in this active shooter category. But that now has tripled, and that was a year ago, so I think it's even higher. You're seeing this all the time. I think it's part of the war mentality, and that, what does the United States do anytime they threaten war? And they go to war and they bomb. And I think that this message now is in all the movies, in our popular culture, the violent video games. Something has happened now that has triggered this very exponentially high level of very violent shootings. And, I don't know what you call this, but terrorism. It doesn't make it, they're senseless. Oftentimes the news will say, recently, who was this? This one recently, a guy shot, a cab driver, I think, in Michigan was shooting. We don't know the motivation. Well, there isn't usually much of a motivation other than the person thinks that I have personal problems. I can't get a date. I can't pay my bills. Whatever my personal problems, I pick up a gun, go to a public place, and shoot everybody, and that will solve my problem.
Right.
And you're going to see that common theme. It's extremely dangerous. That's what we should be focusing on right now.
Well, this is a fascinating topic. It could go and go and go. Would love to have you back on again. Our guest has been former FBI Special Agent Colleen Rowley, named in 2002 as one of Time's Persons of the Year, in particular related to a 2002 memo to then FBI Director Robert Mueller, exposing some of the FBI's pre-9/11 failures. Fascinating story indeed. Colleen, how can people find out more information about you? And if you're doing any writing or appearances, tell us about that, a website or any contact info.
Sure. I often post things. I don't write frequently, but when I do, I write for Huffington Post. So if you put in Colleen Rowley, Huffington Post, you'll come up with my page. And I often cross-post at Consortium News. And Consortium News actually also has a lot of other fine writers, former CIA people, people that are foreign policy specialists. It's one of the best sites out there.
All right. Well, listen, best of luck to you, and would love to have you back on again someday.
Sure. Thank you for having me.
You bet. We will be back with more right after this on Lewis at Large. Well, welcome everybody to another segment of Lewis at Large. Yours truly, Warner Lewis from the flight deck. And of course, that means some Smart Talk Radio is in your future. In this segment, no exception, an old friend of this show, NASA expert Rod Pyle is going to talk about weird space music and lots of other things. He has lectured at NASA's Johnson Space Center, written for the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, Caltech, Life Science, Space.com. We've got a book out. We've got several of them. One of them is called Curiosity, an inside look at the Mars rover mission. He has also produced numerous documentaries for the History Channel and Discovery Communications, and has been on this show 2 or 3 times, and we are pleased to have him back again. One of my favorite people, and I know I am certainly one of his, Rod Pyle. Rod, how are you, my friend?
I'm good, and I'm pleased to be on the flight deck. First time this month.
Yes, you are. Well, Rod, let's do this. Talk a little bit about in the year 2016, bring us up to snuff. Where is the United States? We'll start here. Where are we in terms of space exploration? Are we advancing? Are we treading water? Or are we beginning to fall behind?
Yes to all three.
Okay.
But I'll qualify those answers because that would be unfair. I mean, it's hard not to compare any epic of the American space program to the space race years, because so much was happening then. At the height of Apollo, we were spending 5% of the national budget on space. Things are going fast and furious. By the time I was old enough to really appreciate what was going on, 68, 69, 70, there were flights leaving for the moon every 2 months. So you look at it from that perspective and you think, well, what have we been doing since then? Well, we got involved with the space shuttle, and that was a complicated compromise that was really under budgeted and always dogged with problems, never got up to the flight rate they wanted. And now we've shut that down, and we've got this gap between the end of the shuttle and, quote, what's next, unquote. We've got an uncertain administration when it comes to exactly how they want to handle NASA policy. Then we got Congress and the House pushing back against them. So the net of this is we're building a new rocket. NASA's building a new rocket called the Space Launch System, big Saturn V class rocket. They're still building the Orion capsule. It's left over from our moon plans from the early 2000s. But we've got this gap that we were hoping private industry would fill, but we really didn't send them enough money. So it's just now Elon Musk and SpaceX are right on the cusp of setting up their first human crewed capsule to the space station, and will be shortly followed by Boeing.
What about we had talked about this before last time we talked, and that was, again, let's explore this quickly. And that is, again, the world of private space exploration. A lot of things happening down in New Mexico and other parts of the country. You just brought us up to date a little bit. How are those schedules doing? And also, what about I just lost his name? Is it Richard Anderson, Virgin Airlines guy? Aren't they doing some work as well?
Richard Branson.
Yeah, Richard Branson. Aren't they doing some stuff as well?
Yeah, actually, well, they had that terrible accident last year,
right.
Or maybe the year before, where they lost their test bed space plane, and they're just now finishing the replacement for that. So that will get Virgin Galactic back on their test schedule, but they're already many years behind what was supposed to be the date of their first delivered flights, with a lot of customers tapping their feet impatiently. So, we'll see how that goes. SpaceX has had a little bit better luck, a better profile. They're flying a lot of commercial flights. They've had a couple of situations. They had one rocket where they actually lost the booster on the way up, and then, of course, we watched with anguish the repeated landing attempts. But, for them, landing is just the gravy on the turkey. It really is about building rockets and getting business to launch things into orbit from both government and private industry. So I think SpaceX is the jewel in the crown. And then, of course, Jeff Bezos from Amazon has got Blue Origin, which is a much quieter company, but he's testing his rocket and his capsule, and he's also getting ready to sell engines to a company called the United Launch Alliance for their rockets. So there's a lot happening in the private sector. It's not happening quite as fast as everybody had hoped, but it's close. We're probably a year out from some really important things happening. I might add, SpaceX is also building a large super booster. It's called the Falcon Heavy, which is basically 3 of their rockets strapped together into one big beast that'll be able to lift large cargoes. So I think of the companies, the private sector, SpaceX is the one to watch because they're really pushing the hardest.
Well, let's turn our attention back to NASA, and let's turn our attention back to the United States government. There has been so much advances in technology via whether it's internet-based or cell phone-based or communication-based, but we do not hear much, at least in the everyday working press, about space exploration. It seems like we've taken our eyes off the heavens and we've directed them more towards terra firma and what's going on here on the planet. Is that deliberate? Is that budget-based? Is that the political environment? Or is it the will of the American people, do you think, that right now space, for whatever reason, the cost does not seem worth the reward?
I think those are all really perceptive points, and they're all correct to an extent. The media has fractured and segmented so much. It used to be when NASA did anything, you had three major TV networks and a handful of radio networks that covered it. They were in NASA's pocket, basically, and they gave really good coverage to things as long as it was interesting and different. Now there's a lot of specialized press, but you kind of have to seek that out, and the headlines they do get are gone easily within 24 hours, and people don't necessarily follow it with a lot of passion. That said, when there is a flight like that first test of the Orion capsule or the Curiosity's landing on Mars, people get very excited about it. They just don't tend to stay excited. So what we've got is a situation where we've got a National Space Agency that's operating on a tenth of the budget that they had in the 60s, but they're also running more than 10 times as many programs. In the 60s, everything they flew with people was aimed at going to the moon, and the robots were only going at that point to Mercury, Venus, and Mars. Now you've got dozens and dozens of missions that have been up there for years. We've been tracking Voyager out of the solar system now for a total of almost 40 years. We've got 5 spacecraft working on Mars. We've got the space station that we've got to pay for. So their pie slices are awfully narrow, so it's hard for them to move ahead as aggressively as they want. They also don't have a lot of money to spend on outreach and education, so they do what they can, but it's hard to capture the public's attention these days unless it's something that seems to play into pop culture.
Right, and you're leading right into my next question, and that is the whole concept of pop culture. And let's look at, again, millennials, young people, those people between the ages of, say, 18 and 25. Are you, because I know you're close to the program and you see this industry pretty closely, are you seeing young people still dying to get into, quote, NASA or the space program, or are they, because of lack of coverage or lack of whatever reason, interest, headed more towards more sort of IT kind of and computer-based sciences and disciplines in private industry?
I don't know if I've got a good sample for that, but of the few hundred I've met over the last couple of years, there's a lot of passion out there for space exploration. There's a lot of young people working or interning or trying to get into the Jet Propulsion Laboratory and other parts of NASA. SpaceX, I think the average age of an employee there is probably about 28. And same with a number of the NASA field centers when you get into certain programs. When I go up to JPL to cover an event or sit in on a meeting for the Curiosity rover or something, I'm almost 60, and I'm sitting in this room full of people easily young enough to be my children, thinking,
Yep. You're the oldest guy in the room, probably.
So young again.
Are you the oldest guy in the room?
Often. Fortunately, the guy that usually takes me in, who's one of the public outreach people, is a couple of years older. So I skew the average, but not entirely alone. But yeah, it's people in their late 20s, early 30s, early 40s. And they're brilliant, and they're excited, and they're passionate. And I have to tell you, I did a talk with a group of kids, kind of an informal thing, from it was a University Space Association group, and they were probably 19 to 23. These were undergrads and grad students in aerospace and engineering and so forth. And they started asking me questions about, we were talking about the shuttle, because that's what they remember barely. And then they started asking me questions about the Apollo program, and I talked to them about the excitement of watching these things thundering out of the Cape every 2 months or so during its height, going to the moon, exploring all these amazing places, hours and hours of the images coming down of the two guys on the moon surface, turning over rocks, drilling, exploring, laughing, and at least half of them teared up because they felt like they had really missed something special, and I knew they wondered if it would ever happen again.
Right. What about, and again, if you just joined us, you're listening to Lewis at Large. You know that. Warner Lewis from the flight deck here, and with us is NASA expert Rod Pyle. He has been a guest on this show several times, author of numerous books on space and the technology that carries us there and studies it. His most recent book is Curiosity, an inside look at the Mars rover mission. Rod, let's look back on the space program. Let's go all the way back, if you want, even early 60s, Alan Shepard et al. What, in your opinion, what is the big headline of the space program's greatest achievement or greatest contribution, or two or three of the great contributions would be A, B, and C? And then on the reverse side, two or three places where they may have missed the mark were these. Share your observations on that one.
Ooh, that's a tough one. Well, let me start in reverse order. Missing the mark, I'd have to say a Mars flight, but I will amend that by saying you can't really point your finger at NASA and say you should have done that a long time ago. Now, I've been hearing Mars was 20 to 30 years away since I was 10 years old in terms of a human mission going to that planet. However, at that time, we just a few years past Mariner 4, which was the first flyby of Mars, we didn't know that much about the environment. Now that we've spent more time out there with better instrumentation, we realize that getting between Earth and Mars is really a much more dangerous experience in a more hostile environment than we thought. The radiation is the big killer. That's really, really tough to overcome and requires a lot of engineering. So there are reasons we haven't been to Mars yet, but on an emotional level, I'd say that's the one that I was really had my fingers crossed for. Returning people to the moon is another one. In terms of things that were exciting, and again, this is partially my age playing out here, but I have to say the Apollo flights were really just the most riveting experience of my life. The early shuttle program, just seeing that thing work, as ungainly as it looked, was pretty amazing. And having a chance to interview some of the astronauts in both those programs is just a thrill. And then on the unmanned side, probably because I spent so much time with the people working on the Curiosity mission, I mean, I think all the Mars programs are fascinating and marvelous, and all the deep space and planetary work is sensational. But the Curiosity rover was such a fantastic, wonderful combination of elements in terms of the engineering, that crazy sky crane arrangement that used cables to winch it down to the planet's surface, and that complete analytical laboratory that they carry on board, and the work they've been able to do detecting isotopic numbers and elements down to parts per billion within the samples they're looking at has just really been transformative. And when the next rover goes up in 2020, next NASA rover goes up in 2020, I think we're going to see another big leap in the kind of answers we've been looking for.
Rod, just let me stop you right there specifically on that one. What have we learned about Mars that is I guess I'll call it a pleasant shock to you? What was the big uncovering of a wow moment for you on the Mars so far?
Well, I'm just old enough to remember the days before we had seen Mars close up. When I was very young, it was just a telescopic object, and there was all kinds of fantasies about there's plants, there's forests, there's creatures. Maybe there's still canals, although people didn't think so. The atmosphere's thick enough to fly in, all that kind of stuff. Then the Mariner probe started going past there, and the pictures we got back looked like the surface of the moon. And if you were romantic, they were kind of disappointing. So, I think we've come full circle there. Mars has turned out in the last 2 decades with the rovers in the surface to be this once very wet, apparently verdant planet. There's still enough water locked up in the poles and in subsurface ice to cover the entire planet to a depth of probably about 30 feet. So this was a place that was way ahead of Earth in terms of its development, but then cooled off and died out, lost some of its atmosphere, really was transformed into a desert world. But there is a lot of wonderful things there that we could take advantage of if we can just get people to the surface. There's water for drinking. You can make rocket fuel out of it. You can make breathable oxygen out of it. There's all kinds of other elements in the the soil and the rocks that can be used. So you really have, between the Moon and Mars both, you've got a lot of potential out there for developing a human presence on these worlds, and I think that's the thing that was really transformative about the Mars missions.
You talk about water under the surface on Mars. By the fact that there is water on that planet, does that necessarily mean there is some kind of sustaining life?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? We spent a lot of money trying to figure it out. Curiosity wasn't a life science mission, although it was a, quote, astrobiology mission, unquote, which means it can look for organic compounds, but it can't specifically look for microbes and bacteria unless it just happens to find them somehow. I think the jury's still out on that one. But increasingly, the indications show that with almost dead certainty that there could have been life there, that the environment could have sustained life had it arisen. So the question is, did it? And that brings us into the larger question of, did life on Earth start here? Did it come from an asteroid or a meteorite that came in with organic compounds on it and so forth? Could that have happened at Mars? And I'm not sure we're going to get an answer until we actually either get a sample return or people up there. And that's a ways off.
Are you more, or now that as the years go by, are you more or less certain that life exists somewhere else?
I don't think I've ever had much doubt about it. How it exists and where and whether we're going to find out has been a constantly moving target. The whole SETI experiment, if you can call it that, which has been going on for decades now, is a fascinating thing to ponder. But when you look at the numbers of galaxies and the numbers of star systems, and now we know the numbers of planets, there's lots and lots and lots of solar systems out there, it's really, really hard to believe that it hasn't arisen in many other places. Right. Now, whether it started and failed early or started and snuffed itself out through technological hubris like we've almost done a couple of times, or whether it's something else, in these vast distances is preventing us from hearing their communications, is something that nobody knows. But some very smart people have said they think we're going to find something in the next 10 to 20 years. They're talking about signals from an advanced civilization. I'd be happy just to find bacteria on Mars, but I think either one is, in my book, either one seems like almost a certainty within the next 20 to 30 years.
What, go out 3-5 years. Let's go past the next election, regardless of who is elected. What do you see is the future of a government-sponsored or government-sanctioned research? NASA, give us its future. Is it bright? What needs to happen to kickstart it? If it's not, prognosticate for us a little bit on that.
It's bright but incremental. We've got the James Webb Telescope going up pretty soon, which is going to be another order of excellence over what we've already experienced with Hubble in terms of the ability to discern things that are very far away and very small, and probably looking right back at the beginning of time. I mean, this thing has so much light gathering capability and is so incredibly sophisticated that you'll be able to look right back almost to the Big Bang, or as close as you get to the Big Bang. So that's exciting. Of course, as I said, we've got the Orion capsule and the SLS rocket booster coming up, and that is capable of going well beyond low Earth orbit. You can go to the Moon. You could eventually, with some added hardware, go out to Mars and the Martian moons, but it really takes money and commitment, and I think NASA knows what they want to do. They know how to do it, but you've got administration shifts to worry about. You've got congressional pressure to worry about. Are you building any parts of your rocket in my district? All that kind of stuff. And as you alluded to earlier, the public's attention and affection for this has drifted a bit, and I think there's a big gaping question of, why do we really need to do this? It's exciting, it's engaging, it's adventure, the way a lot of us see it. But I think there's still a lot of people, as there were in the 60s, who say, well, why do we really need this? And that's a tough thing to answer. A lot of good things come out of space development. I mean, there's incredible benefits for education, engineering, technology, medical science. The list goes on and on and on. We've talked about that before. But selling that to John Q. Public is a tall order, and that's one reason NASA has a small education outreach budget, and that's one reason I write books.
Well, Rod, what about where are we now in the world space race? What are the feelings of some of the other countries that were involved, and are there other not newer countries, but countries that have not done space exploration in any real way in the past? Are they coming on board at all?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we were in a foot race with the Russians to get to the moon in the 60s, and that was a race that we won and then abandoned. We're paying the Russians now to fly people to our space station in the hardware that they developed to go to the moon, but never used to go to the moon. They've been using it to go to orbit for all these decades since. The Russians make a lot of announcements. Not a lot of those are followed up in terms of big projects, so it's unclear what their future is going to be. They'll have a presence in space, but I don't think it's going to be a whole lot more robust in the next 10 years. Really, the new players on the block are the Chinese. They've had a space program of sorts for decades, but it got a slow start. They've been flying people in orbit for about 10 years now, and they're about to set up their second small space station. But they have big plans. They're talking about going to the moon with human beings in the early 2020s. And there have been mutterings about Mars. I'm not sure how serious they are in terms of that, in terms of hardware yet, but they're very ambitious. And the nice thing about being part of the Chinese space effort is if they make a commitment and they say we're going to fund this for 10 years, they can, because they don't have the kind of political shifts that we do here that will suddenly yank the rug out from under a specific initiative like returning to the moon. India is now getting engaged. They're less on the human spaceflight side and more on the unmanned side. They have an orbiter around Mars that's been very successful. So there's a lot of what are becoming major technological powers that weren't 25, 30 years ago who are starting to enter this race, and then private companies within those countries as well.
Well, this guy continue his search for little green men, like we all do. We may find some more little green men, maybe right here on Earth. But his name is Rod Pyle, and he was for many years produced numerous documentaries for the History Channel and Discovery Communications, including the acclaimed Modern Marvels Apollo 11 episode. He lectures at NASA's Johnson Space Center, written for the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, numerous books on space flight and space exploration. Rod, how can Lewis at Large listeners who are still interested in this subject find out more about your writings and some more information about you?
I've got a website at pylebooks.com. That's PYLE books.com. And then my books and 2 new titles coming out this year are all listed up on Amazon.
So when are you going up into space? When's it going to be you?
Never, I believe. I'd like to, but I'm one of those guys, and I hate to admit it, but let's make the premiere admission on your show. When I'm between floors in the elevator and it slows down for an extra second, I break a little bit of a sweat, and that's in an elevator. And if you've ever seen the inside of a space capsule, just not sure I could sit in there for as long as it takes to go up and come.
Yeah, it looks a little snug in there. Indeed, it does.
It's snug.
Well, listen, thank you so much, and we'll definitely have you back on again, and appreciate your time.
Great pleasure. Thank you.
You bet. We will be back with more right after this on Lewis at Large.